So Michael Gove has been at it again. In the Times he wrote, "It's the technocrats who have brought us the disaster of the euro, the immiseration of the Greek people, record youth unemployment in Spain and Portugal, unsustainable property booms and then crashes in Spain and Ireland, the weakening of Germany and Italy's banking structures, and a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Oh yes, and a total failure to either predict, provide for, or prevent the financial crisis of 2008. So this morning we have a panel of economic experts who may wish to disagree with Michael. I will introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. First of all, on my second left, Julian Harris, who is the Deputy Editor of City AM. Second to speak on my far left will be Iain Martin, who's an author and commentator on politics and finance and the editor of Rejection. Third will be Angus Kennedy on the far right, who's the convener of the Academy and the author of Being Cultured in Defence of Discrimination. Fourth will be Vicky Pryce on my right, who's a board member of the Centre for Economics and Business Research and an economic advisor to the British Chamber of Commerce. And lastly, on my immediate left, Jonathan Porters, who is a Principal Research Fellow for the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, a Senior Fellow, UK in a Changing Europe, and the author of 50 Capitalist Ideas You Really Need to Know. So, Julian.
Thank you. So when I started as an economics reporter, one of the first pieces of advice I was given was, when you read the word forecast, as you often do in City AM and the FT, anywhere else, sub it out in your head and put in the word guess. And it adds, of course, doing this gives you a kind of inherent skepticism about it stops you from falling into the idea that you can, in economics, we're dealing with something which can be quite comfortably predicted by these often very well-paid, not perhaps economists to my right, but people at banks, these economists and analysts who are paid to forecast what's going to happen into the economy. Another piece of advice I actually give all of our reporters now is, well, I don't quite ban it, but we heavily discourage the use of the word expert in stories. And this is something which especially young reporters do. They'll put, experts say this, experts say that, often as the top line of a story, even a headline. Or when quoting people, they'll say, this so-and-so expert, Jonathan Porter slammed George Osborne's fiscal strategy. In fact, I've probably deleted expert in front of Jonathan's name a few times and subbed it out for economist, or even worse, Westminster-based economist, or something like this. And the reason I did this, and the reason I like the advice that was given to me, is because for quite a while I was aware of this risk of sort of the deification of experts, of people who study a field, and when they're quoted, especially alone and in an unchallenged way, it can give the impression that this is someone who has an opinion, and we should all accept this, and that's something which, of course, was alluded to in Michael Gove's recent piece in the Times. So a couple of years ago, if you'd have, I would have kind of, I think, been on that side of the debate. So it's been a bit of a surprise. What I didn't foresee was the kind of speed that there'd be this element of the public debate which would swing so violently in that other direction. And actually, we seem to have moved in the last 6 months or a year, or whenever it is, on both sides of the pond, towards, as people are calling it, this sort of post-fact political environment, where we have politicians such as Michael Gove really doing the opposite. We've moved from the deification of technocrats, experts, or whatever we're going to say, towards the demonization. And this has kind of shifted my position, where I now think I think there is clearly a danger in giving too much power to unaccountable technocrats and in such an unchallenged way. There is also a far greater danger in the aggressive political discrediting of people who often are just endeavouring to understand the economy and try to help us to navigate it in the most informed way that we can. And I think it's especially alarming when those moves come from politicians themselves, who are often being held accountable by those experts or technocrats. So in this field, I mean, if when John McDonnell says, I can save the public purse £200 billion a year through cracking down on tax avoidance, it's a good thing that we have whoever it is, the IFS, for example, saying, well, that's a complete lie, that's nonsense. When we have a very high-profile and crucial political campaign where people are saying there's a £350 million weekly dividend inherent in leaving the EU, and plastering it on the side of many buses driving around the country, it's a good thing that we have people to question that. I suppose that's where I conclude this opening 5 minutes, is to say we need to find a balance between those 2 points, essentially, that of course having these unchallenged, unaccountable views it can be very dangerous, yet at the same time that the most important thing, of course, in any democracy is holding politicians accountable and moving towards an environment where political rhetoric and kind of the heart and political instinct and bias trumps people in more independent, neutral positions is obviously not a good place for us to be.
Thank you. Iain?
I suppose part of what we're talking about is the failure of the predictive powers of the elite, which you could say politicians, academics, you might include journalists, but as a journalist I never really think of journalists as particularly elite or praiseworthy. It's a trade rather than a profession. But the idea being that through the use of data, insight, expertise, that there was an elite that knew and could explain what's happening now and predict what's going to happen. And it's not really a surprise if voters, having seen what's happened in the West in the last 15 years, are sceptical of experts. I mean, if you just look at the litany from 9/11 through the Iraq War, the rise of ISIS, the failure to predict, to spot the financial crisis, the aftermath of the financial crisis, the near failure of the euro crisis, all of those incidents and periods at their root involve the failure of elites and technocrats. But you might expect me as a pro-market, free market person to say, well, you see, what this all proves is it proves the failure of central planning, and that this is actually a pure argument for the pro-market or for the conservative point of view. But I see it slightly differently, actually. I think what's really fallen apart is the post-Reagan Thatcher settlement. And actually it's partly, and I say this as a pro-market person, it's partly a market failure or a failure of the post-1980s analysis. And the idea not only that markets have had it all covered, but that the answer lies in data, numbers, and the ultimate expression of this idea that we'd conquered these problems, that through technocratic expertise, we had somehow managed to get to a situation where we had ended the economic cycle, that we'd smoothed out economics so that you would never get a recession, or as Gordon Brown put it, that we had effectively ended boom and bust. And I think the disintegration of that in the financial crisis and in the aftermath means that we live in a really fascinating period in which a lot of the old answers that the Thatcherites or the Reaganites would offer no longer really apply. And I think what's most interesting about the Brexit vote is that the public, a large part of the public, certainly in England, worked this out. And I think it was the logical culmination of the failure in the financial crisis, in which a global elite had said, effectively, we float above national governments. There are supranational organizations. We have the market sorted out. We know precisely what we're doing. All of you, anyone who objects is quite obviously racist and mad. And then the bill for the financial crisis landed, and the bill was national and was paid by national taxpayers. So I think what the Brits have done in rebelling, as Michael Gove put it, against experts, and I'm sure he's not. I don't think he particularly enjoys being reminded of that famous interview where he said we've had enough of experts. But what he was trying to say was that we've been through a long period in which experts claim to have the answers, and I think the Brits with Brexit are doing something quite bold and transgressive and rejecting that settlement, sort of post-1980s globalized settlement, or at least demanding, so it's a correction of course, it doesn't mean the end of globalization, but it means an assertion of national prerogatives. And 1 minute. And I think we've done something rather bold and interesting and praiseworthy.
Thank you. Iain gets the first person to mention Brexit prize for this.
Brexit bingo.
Angus.
You could have predicted somebody would mention it.
Yeah.
I think I would echo a lot of the points that Julian and Iain have been making, and also agree with a lot that Michael Gove was saying. He wrote that article as a response to Mark Carney telling Theresa May off in no uncertain terms because she'd had the temerity to question some of his policies around quantitative easing and interest rates. And he ticked her off. He said, in quite chilling words, I think, that we are not going to take instruction from the political side. The policies are done by technocrats. And he seems to just suffer something of a sense of humour failure, really, in saying that. But it has been a very widespread view, as people have been saying for some time, that technocrats and economists and economics can sort of float above political decisions and national decisions and sort of lay down the law in terms of what should happen to people. And, in some ways it's a welcome backlash, I'm sure, the sort of kickback against experts. And we can all have lots of fun pointing out, as I will do, a bit, about how spectacularly wrong many of the predictions have been. I mean, some 90% of economists thought that Brexit would lead to an immediate, not a long term, they're now revising their predictions, saying something bad will happen in the future, which is always a pretty safe prediction, actually, especially in economics, but yeah, actually in every field of human life, bad things will happen if you wait long enough. But they went much further than that, didn't they? There were going to be immediate bad consequences in terms of crash in investment, crash in consumer confidence, which spectacularly has not happened. 250,000 more people were going to be unemployed, which hasn't happened. And so the list goes on about how people got Brexit spectacularly wrong. And Mark Carney has not been very good at making predictions. Since he came into his position in 2013, he's been predicting every year that interest rates will rise. And he manages to get that wrong every year, which I think is ironic because he's the one man in the country with the power to make his own predictions come true. He could just save economics as a science by reaching out and raising interest rates. In fact, he's done the opposite. Although he's predicted that they would rise, he most recently has lowered them again. So the predictions are not working, but I don't think that's what's new in a way. Economists and economics have regularly always got predictions wrong. Otherwise, they would be spectacularly rich and not having to sub-edit out the word expert. You'd be kicking back on the Côte d'Azur if economists could get predictions right. I think it's more more a matter that economics has been pushed too much centre stage as politicians have taken something of a step back. And there's some degree of reassertion of the importance and primacy of politics at the moment happening, but also in slightly narrow way, which I'll just maybe come on to in my sort of final point, is that as politicians have sought to hide behind the sort of supposedly hard science of economics and devolved responsibility, famously into the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, they've devolved what should be their number one job, which is controlling, to the extent they can, the economy, trying to improve the economy, which is how we live. They've stepped back from that primary responsibility and handed it off to so-called experts. That's, I think, led economists into a temptation to believe that their science is more predictive, has more determining power than they would do otherwise. It leads them to believe it's some kind of a mechanistic science. But it's not. I mean, economics is really about relationships between people, not between things. And people, it's not that they're inherently unpredictable, but that they follow rational interests. And so politics, and maybe political economy, can have some predictive power over what people do to the extent that it sets policies, unlike Mark Carney. I think politicians, if they set policies, can have an influence on the economy to some degree. Though in the current moment, I would rather just that they did less, really. Less interference in the economy would seem to be a quite good predictor of better things happening than the routine interference that goes on at the moment. And if politicians need to take back any sort of control of the economy, it might be to stop propping up sections of it that really should be let go. Maybe do no more than lay the growth for the possibility of economic progress. Maybe make a decision over Heathrow and Gatwick. I don't see why we can't have 2 new runways at least. Make a decision over nuclear and accelerate those decisions.
Okay. Thank you.
That would be
That's it.
That would be it.
Vicky?
Well, I mean, I have to say I couldn't disagree more with everything I just heard from Angus. I mean, I'm an economist, and I wish indeed that we dominated the scene, but in fact we don't. I worked for the government for quite some time, and what you experience is that, in fact, your voice is just not heard unless you really, really push. Because nobody wants to know that a scheme that they have been very lovingly pursuing for quite some time, that's the politicians, isn't actually delivering the results. So very little evaluation is done in government, which actually is there to prove your cost benefit. Decisions are made or not made, such as the airport expansion area, which you just mentioned, Angus, where there is the evidence that it's actually going to be good for the UK economy. What's happening? Nothing is happening for so long, even though the evidence is there. So, and a lot of what we were trying to do in government, I've had times when I had to get direction from my Secretary of State, because I said this even at the middle of the financial crisis, where we were saying this is what we need to do, or this particular scheme is not going to give you the benefits that you want. The government still wanted it done, so they go ahead, give you direction, and you have to do it. So actually, I'm sorry to have to say, and disappoint anyone who wants to be a government economist, since I used to be joint head of the Government Economic Service, we have to push to be heard. The technocrats have to push to be heard, because politics intervenes. And when you talk about how can you predict, I mean, it is absolutely true that you can't do lots of random controlled experiments in the way that you do with science. And of course, the consumer, for some weird reason, has his own views and her own views on what they want to do at a particular time. So the consumer function is impossible to estimate. And there's always been a problem. The Bank of England has had this problem for a long period of time. Are they going to save more? Are they going to suddenly go out and spend more? What are the things that you need to do to get them to behave the way a rational person would behave? And we have, of course, altered everything. We are now assuming rationality to a considerable extent. But the one you can't really filter in properly is politician irrationality. So we make predictions, guesses, if that's what you want, on the basis of known facts, history of how people behave, given particular pressures that they get or particular encouragements we give them. And then politics intervenes. So here we are with Europe. who has left the EU before? At least a big country left the EU before? Nobody. So we are in uncharted territory. So what did actually Carney do? The reason why some of those worst predictions have not yet been proved to be correct is because Carney saw the disaster that was ahead, saw the financial crisis that was looming. He was the only person to appear at 8 o'clock in the morning on the Today programme and say, I'm here to help. A little bit like, you have those cartoons of a woman usually with high heels holding a briefcase and saying, I'm a civil servant, I'm here to help. And usually people laugh about this. But Carney actually was there as a policymaker, if you want to call him that, saying, I'm going to support the banking system. I'm going to take away the counter-cyclical buffers that the banks need to get for next year. So 150 billion into the economy can come that way. I'm going to cut interest rates, which he did. I'm going to have quantitative easing, which means loads of liquidity in the system. What happens? Sterling, of course, stays low. Manufacturing exports do reasonably well. Share prices go up because sterling is going to stay low. So all these things has been engineered by your technocrats while the politicians were asleep. They would have, I sometimes think how nice it would have been if he had done nothing. It would have been really interesting to see what the environment would be. And then he gets attacked by an expert, made Michael Gove suddenly an expert to attack experts. And let's just think about the euro. If we attack the Europe, I'm Greek, I know how horrible it's all been. I know that the IMF has been a disaster in terms of what it did for Greece. But it wasn't the economists necessarily in Greece that were saying, it wasn't us who were saying that actually what the IMF was doing was correct. In fact, we did here the 5 economic tests, slightly politically supervised, but actually they made it very, very clear, because of course it was under Gordon Brown, they made it very, very clear that our experts said, and I worked on them up to a point, that we should not join the euro. So which experts exactly is he shouting about? Because the experts here certainly made it very, very clear that that wasn't the case. Now, politics had intervened in Europe because they had all been sold the story that it was all going to be painless, which is exactly what happened with the Brexit vote. Everyone's been sold the story it's going to be painless. I did a radio interview among 4 interviews yesterday because obviously things are turning bad. And the interviewer was saying, so all these things are happening which are really rather worrying, inflation going up just as you guys predicted. Why didn't anyone listen to this before? Well, perhaps Angus will tell us that maybe it was all a dream. The sterling hasn't fallen, inflation is not rising. Well, that's interesting. Consumers are beginning to become more pessimistic. Business confidence suggests that investment is going to be very, very flat over the coming year, if not fall. So that's not good news.
One minute,
let's hope
please.
that politicians intervene. Like Hammond does something to reflate the economy in November, and then we might be doing better. But thank God for the technocrats intervening to ensure we didn't see the fallout that we would otherwise have seen.
Jonathan.
Thanks. So I didn't prepare anything, so I assumed there would be plenty to react to in what other people said, and I wasn't disappointed, of course. So let me start with picking up Angus on a couple of specific points. Quote from Mark Carney, "We're not going to take instructions from the political side." What Angus admitted was, he said, in order to achieve our mandate, or on how to achieve our mandate. And that mandate is set out in the Bank of England Act 1997, passed through Parliament, proposed and passed by democratically elected politicians. What Carney was saying was the law passed by a democracy tells us that our job is to independently achieve the 2% inflation target, which the Parliament of the UK has set us. So in telling Theresa May that he wasn't going to take instructions on how to achieve what the Act of Parliament had told him to achieve, he was simply upholding what the democratically elected Parliament had told him to do. He was not saying that economic policy was purely a technocratic function, quite the opposite. He was setting out how, within the political framework that exists in the UK, he had been legally mandated to achieve that function. He's not allowed to take instructions from Theresa May on how to achieve his mandate. That's what the Act says, and that's what we have told him to do. So the point is, in this case, completely the opposite. Similarly, on the reference to the Office of Budget Responsibility, which of course doesn't actually make economic policy, it does do forecasts, as it is, again, legally mandated to do. And if anyone has ever seen Robert Choate present the forecast of the Office of Budget Responsibility, the first thing he always says at every press conference is, these forecasts will be wrong because that is the nature of economic forecasts. No economist has any doubt about the uncertainty of economic forecasts. So what are experts good for in that case? Well, I mean, to give the sort of example that Vicky was talking about in context of actually making the sort of policies that affect people's day-to-day lives outside the grand macroeconomic stuff. 4 years ago, I wrote about the government's Troubled Families program. I said that because the program had been based on a number that the Prime Minister had simply taken off the shelf, the 120,000 families from hell number, which was essentially invented, and because the targets given to local authorities were based on this essentially made-up number, that this program would, despite being well-intentioned and based on some good ideas, would almost inevitably result in a huge waste of taxpayers' money. Last week, the official government evaluation showed that it had indeed achieved essentially none of its key objectives, and the net impact of the program as measured was close to zero. I mean, as a consequence of the government's failure to listen to me and other experts like me who actually understand some of the details of these micro-level policies, we've wasted possibly up to £440 million. Now, that's not huge compared to the financial crisis, but that is the sort of thing experts can usefully do. So what does that mean in general terms? I think, the important thing for me is to distinguish between three kinds of expert claims. On the first kind is one where there is a genuine, clear scientific consensus, and the people who argue against it are either nuts or deliberately trying to distort the debate. Examples of that, MMR and Andrew Wakefield, obviously the best one recently known. The 350 million a week claim, which was simply a lie. You just had to be able to add up to understand that. At the other end, you have things like economic forecasts. And Julian's quite right here. I mean, they're not quite guesses. I would describe them as scenarios, but they're primarily scenarios rather than forecasts. They're not intended by anybody who understands what they're doing to be predictions of what the future will be. The difficult area for journalists and the media, and hence the public, is the in-between stuff. So, for example, not the short-term forecasts about Brexit, but the medium and long-term forecasts about Brexit, that there would be some significant economic damage to the long-term economic health and prosperity of the country resulting from Brexit, anywhere from 2% to 8% of GDP, depending on the scenario, depending on the time frame, depending on what happens. And now that general opinion, not specific numbers, but that general view, represents a broad consensus of most mainstream economists. That doesn't make it true, that doesn't mean it will necessarily happen, but it is a broad consensus. And it doesn't mean that the people who differ from that consensus are nuts or stupid or trying to mislead, but it does mean that they are at a relatively small minority among economists. So, in my view,
1 minute.
It's important that the public should realize both that there is uncertainty, but equally that there is a degree of consensus around the expert view. And that is a very, very difficult balance for the media to strike. And it's very difficult to convey that subtlety, that type of opinion is in between this is basically certain and this is basically a scenario or a guess. And trying to explain that, both for experts and the media, seems to me in order to inform the public debate, is the key challenge for us.
Can we show our appreciation for all the speakers? I will go straight out to the floor for any questions.
Angus usefully told us that economics is not deterministic. I think that's something that's very, very well understood by people practicing not just economics, but any kind of modelling and forecasting and so on. Yet certainty is really comforting for people, for politicians, for voters and so on. It can be played to quite easily. And as Vicky said, you need to, as an expert, often make yourself really loud and make yourself shout. And often sometimes that means obscuring the uncertainties behind the things you're predicting and only shouting about the mean or the average or so on. And so, for me, how much does this mean that some of the fall of expert is to do with a failure of uncertainty communication? in the Netherlands, on the front cover of one of the major broadsheets, I've seen statistics with confidence intervals. I couldn't imagine that happening in the UK.
Hello, well, I am an economist, and I was one of the signatories of an advertisement that appeared in the Daily Telegraph, I think it was, 2 days before the referendum campaign. So I think I'm one of the so-called experts Michael Gove had in his sights. Could I make just a couple of points to, I think it'll be fairly clear I'm supporting Vicky and Jonathan, but there's a very important distinction between conditional and unconditional forecasts. Most of the forecasts that economists get wrong are unconditional forecasts. We just can't make unconditional forecasts which are correct because there's so many things that could happen we can't predict. What is the rate of inflation going to be over the next 2 years? Well, you tell me what's going to happen to the price of oil, what's going to happen in the US presidential election. Tell me 20 other things that we just can't predict. I might be able to do a good job at predicting what's going to happen in the next 2 years, but we just can't do this. So unconditional predictions are almost certainly going to be wrong, and for good reason. But some of the predictions economists make are conditional predictions. For example, the assessment of the costs of Brexit. What difference does Brexit make? Well, I think this needs to be taken much more seriously. I think economists are much better at making conditional forecasts as compared with unconditional forecasts. And secondly, economists get a lot of things wrong. Yes, I agree entirely. But we also get a lot of things right. And I think economic policy is better than it was. Take, for example, the reaction to the financial crisis. What happened in 2007, 2008? Well, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Ben Bernanke, was one of the leading scholars of the Great Depression. And what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis, central banks brought down interest rates and all the rest of it, meant that the aftermath of the financial crisis was far less bad, far less severe. It was painful, it was severe, but it was far less worse than what happened in the Great Depression, where the central bank reacted completely in the wrong way. So I'd say, although economists make a lot of mistakes, we do know more about the economy than we did, and I think economic policy is better than it was.
I think we need to more clearly distinguish between different things. So experts, technocrats and technocracy are completely different things. So someone, for example, who spent their whole life studying Ming Dynasty Chinese pottery is an expert in Ming Dynasty pottery, but they're not a technocrat. That's not the same thing. I would take economics to be the kind of technocratic discipline par excellence, although not the only one that is technocratic. And I think the key distinguishing feature of that is this idea that you can separate the facts, the hard facts and the values, and we, the economists, we're the ones dealing with the really important stuff, the facts, which I think is a kind of very questionable kind of assumption. But I think the real problem is technocracy, which is ruled by experts, which is the idea that it's the experts that make the key political decisions. And I think in this respect, I disagree with the way Jonathan came back on Angus, because I think the problem in relation to the Bank of England and its mandate, it's not Mark Carney's fault in a sense. I think the fault is the fault of politicians in that they have evacuated a lot of the ground of key decision-making to the experts. So in my mind, the proper people to make decisions about interest rates are politicians, because they are elected. The level of interest rates is a key decision in terms of how the economy is run. So it should be politicians who make that decision. But it's certainly true that, in this case, the 1997 Labour government evacuated that terrain to the Bank of England, to technocrats, and brought it into the sphere of technocracy, ruled by technocrats. And I think fundamentally it's technocracy that is the problem that we should really be standing up against if we believe in democracy.
Thank you. I think the example of politicians selecting interest rates went really well in 1992, and I think we can probably all learn from that. Michael Gove, think about Michael Gove. I think Philip Pullman described it really beautifully when that interview occurred. He said, when an intelligent man advocates stupidity, he's after something and you should watch him. And I think we need to be very careful about the way politicians will misuse experts, misuse expertise. and try and simplify arguments that really are essentially really quite complicated. The benefits or disadvantages of staying in the European Union are complex. They cannot be put down to simple statements. And one of the concerns that I have with this argument about the fall of expertise is you don't take the time to actually listen to people and weigh up the different arguments. It is so much easier for a politician to say £350 million than it is to actually think about what that sum represents and how that number is achieved. So my concern is not about expertise, it's about the use of politicians, the use of expertise. Thank you.
Just picking up on that point from someone down the front earlier about having confidence intervals shown in the media. I think part of the problem, and also coming back on what the person just said, is that the politicians don't have a good enough background in being able to interpret uncertainty. So it's not just that they're presenting uncertainty to the public in the wrong way. I don't think they always appreciate it. So if they're given a number with an uncertainty interval on it, they just see the number. And okay, they may have a spin that they want to put on it, but I think if they understood the difference between consensus and everybody agreeing with absolutely every aspect of some argument, that would be very useful.
I wanted to ask about possibly experts holding politicians and the government to account. And I'm thinking here about how the IFS has become, in effect, a kind of informal opposition to whatever the government says in the budget, that, you know, instantly the BBC and other organisations will go to the IFS to comment on it. It's almost as though they're saying, we know that the government has spun these figures and we want you to unpick them for us. Now, we've all got used to that as a matter of course. Is that right? Is that what the IFS should be doing? Is that how we should use experts? Or is that somehow troubling?
I just wanted to make one broader point, which is that something very interesting happens in the 20th century, which is that politicians, partly because electorates want this, but also obviously because of the rise of the mainstream left, start to talk about the future and mapping out the future in a way which would have been alien to the Georgians or to the Victorians. You kind of operated in the now. You and the Victorians accepted that there was something totally chaotic about how human development worked and how institutions evolved. You get into the 20th century and it's the idea of planning the glorious future. You only need to look at those wonderful Labour Party adverts and films from 1945. The Tory party then, of course, has to mimic that. And what that does to our politics is it means that we're very often asking our politicians to map out a vision of the future 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, which we would all be better accepting is it's impossible to do with any certainty. And I think those who are asking the politicians to be a bit more open to complexity and projecting those arguments in a much more complex way. I mean, they're living very high speed, working with a media which has a very short attention span because consumers have a short attention span and they're trying to communicate things in 10, 15 seconds and they don't have 5 minutes as academics and journalists do. So I have some sympathy with them, but I think it's something bigger culturally about our obsession with thinking that we can plot our way to a glorious future. I think the Burkean approach ends up being much more realistic and pragmatic about human nature.
Angus?
I mean, I don't want to be accused of just being plain nuts, or even worse, a failure to listen to Jonathan. So I think Jonathan's exactly right in the sort of narrow technical explanation he gave of the Bank of England's role, as has been pointed out, given to it by democratic mandate. My point is just that democratic mandate should be withdrawn, right? That they should not have this independence of political control, because the economy is politics in some senses. It is a matter of how we live together, and it should be very much the business of politicians to decide how that economy is going to be organised and make decisions. And as I've said, I think they should actually be doing rather less than more. But nonetheless, they should be the ones in control. And I have to disagree as well, I think, with Vicky, is that I don't see politicians as sort of the grit in the otherwise perfectly well-oiled flywheel of economics. If they would only just listen to the evidence of Heathrow and get on and do what the economists tell them, I just don't think it works that way. I think the people arguing, I think, for the economists that I've heard here seem very sure of the rightness of their predictions. So everybody is saying, oh, Brexit's a big, complicated, hard to predict thing, and it's going to be bad. Nobody seems to have any doubt about the rightness of that prediction. Certainly the people arguing for the economists. And I think it is, as somebody said, an event without precedence. We've got no idea how it's going to play out. But if politicians try and shape Brexit in the interests of the British economy, that seems to be me more likely to have a positive outcome than giving it up to the absence of any political control over our economy, which is why people voted for Brexit.
Okay, Jonathan?
I thought I was very clear that I didn't, while there was a broad consensus among economists that Brexit would have some negative impact on the UK economy, there is a lot of uncertainty about that, and it depends very much what happens, in particular what actions politicians take. But I do think and that segues into a broader point about which some of the people in the audience made. So the Treasury analysis of the medium to long-term impact of Brexit was, in my view, I had my criticism of it, and others did as well, but other economists did as well, but it was a pretty reasonable reflection of that consensus. It presented a number of scenarios. None of them will actually happen, but in terms of illustrating a range of plausible scenarios and the range of potential impacts on the UK economy, it was based on actually some things we do know quite well about the economy. It wasn't based on short-term macro forecasting at all. It was based on things that we know from history, from empirical data, from empirical evidence about the relationship between integrated economic areas and free trade areas on the one hand, and trade in goods, services, and movements of capital and investment on the other, and between those variables and growth, productivity, and output. All those are reasonably well established. So, it doesn't give you an exact answer, but it does give you, as I said, a reasonable degree of consensus about the possible broad impacts over the medium to long term. And nothing that's happened since the referendum, by the way, in any way questions that analysis at all. We should be quite clear about that. What I do agree with, though, is it's quite difficult, and going back to what I was saying, it's very difficult to present that to the public, and indeed, as some of the questioners said, it's very difficult for politicians to present that, sometimes because of ignorance, although equally as often because that's not what they want to. And here, I think, the distinction I make here is between that analysis and the way that George Osborne presented that analysis. He said, what this analysis shows is it will cost the average British household £4,300 a year. Now that clearly was a deliberate attempt to compress a sophisticated, serious, reasonably rigorous analysis of a range of scenarios into a single headline number, and to present with a certainty which absolutely wasn't there in the analysis. And in that sense, it was almost as bad as the Leaves campaign £350 million a year figure. And that, it seems to me, that politicians behaving like that does far more damage to both to the reputation of experts, in this case the reputation of the Treasury, and to the public debate than the analysis itself.
Okay, thank you, Julian.
I want to touch on that question of media coverage and come back to the first question, which touched on it as well, and the issue of confidence intervals being printed in, was it the Dutch? The Dutch press. It reminded me of a few years ago, a member of the public sent me two of my front page stories back, and he corrected them to desensationalise the stories. So where he'd gone through the whole thing, and so whereas I'd written, I don't know, global mining stocks plummeted yesterday as chaos spread across trading floors. He'd written some shares in some mining companies adjusted yesterday to one piece of macroeconomic data, and have gone through the whole thing along those lines. So, I mean, I've always been, of course, our response to this in the newsroom is, or if we printed his version, no one would read it, even though it's free. But I think so this has been something at the forefront of my mind for some time. Of course, is how much, to what extent is the media justified in picking a strong top line, and in some might say sensationalizing it, or in spinning it in a strong way. And I think that there's almost a different question, which is that we're not going to get away from the fact that this has to happen in the press because people have, or in the media more generally, because people do have short attention spans, but also they need to be grabbed. Attention needs to be grabbed itself. I think more of a question, and something which has come up recently, is you can still do that. You can still have strong stories, strong top lines, while getting across the topic, the issue of uncertainty, the fact of uncertainty. And this is something that we try to do, so is present both sides of, and this is why you present both sides. This is what we try to hammer into our reporters, is that in doing so, you throw uncertainty into the equation. So you can say, this politician made this ridiculous claim about a fiscal dividend, but this one said this is what the IFS said, and then you still have a very strong story, but you include very much that notion of uncertainty. And I think there's a danger at the moment in the way that the media is going. If you look on, like Twitter's a very good example, and there are some people on here who have a lot of followers. I mean, I find in all areas of Twitter, especially with politics, though, the way that you get a large audience is to basically preach to a certain choir, and just to keep going and keep going. And there are some people, absolutely, I'm not taking a swap, people who frankly wouldn't be invited to this kind of debate, who have a terrifying amount of influence, who just regurgitate one side of debate, and people who believe in them just retweet them, and it goes on and on and on. Okay, I'll wrap up. So I think that there is a question about how we get back to people when you have to take a newspaper. You have to traditionally you had to consider a broader range of views. Very quickly coming back to the
later you'll get another go.
Right.
Vicky.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll be quick. I mean, it's interesting. We've just been hearing about the media's role. Of course, quite recently we got headlines, probably also in City AM, saying OECD or IMF wrong about negative impact of Brexit. A revised forecast up for, Britain will be a very fast-growing economy in 2016. So what had happened is that, and we were all at pains to explain it, they upped the forecast by 0.1%. So for this year, from 1.7 to 1.8. So, and that was considered to be good enough for a headline and for everyone to then tweet and retweet how wonderful the economy was doing. And yet, I mean, the papers fell for that. I mean, here we are talking about, it's guesswork and so on, and yet they just love the 0.1 change for forecast for this year. So it would be interesting to see how we report what happens next. The independence of the central bank, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Please look at history. Booms and busts. The whole point was to stop them. Of course, you can't necessarily because we're so interconnected, but that is what Gordon Brown tried to do. He may not have done it fantastically well in terms of just, the way that he reorganized everything, including the FSA and so on at the time, and that may have been partly instrumental in perhaps the oversight on the financial sector not being so good. But nevertheless, I think having an independent central bank is absolutely a must. And that, of course, is what's happening all across the world. And to change that and have the politicians intervene would be an absolute disaster. What you can do to change the target, say we want 4% growth, inflation, 10%. That, of course, will wipe out our debts. Fantastic. We can all survive with that. That would be brilliant. IFS, very, very good question. I'm afraid I sit on the council of the IFS, so I have to be a bit careful, but we've all got connections with that. But it just proves that we can't trust the politicians, I'm afraid. We absolutely do want advice from the experts on what that means. You know, whatever we may think. You may want more interference. By God, we spent all our time in Whitehall making sure they didn't pick winners and make the wrong mistakes, which, of course, they very often have done in the past. But this heading is the fall of the... What we're talking about is the fall of the experts. I mean, the first point on Heathrow is that, of course, it isn't just economists, it's all the other experts there. So don't just blame the economists for it. I think that would be completely wrong, and it also is unfair on all these other experts, environmental and everything else, who've been involved in all this. But we talk about the fall of the experts. I don't know about the rest of my panelists here, but I know it for certain for Jonathan and the amount of stuff that's been written in the papers, we haven't been... There's been a rare period when we've been in more demand, in fact, because people want support, want to understand this uncertainty, and they don't want you to tell them exactly what's going to happen. They want to know what, if that happens, you know, if these negotiations go that way, what would be the implications? So they really like to be taken through, just like Jonathan was saying, these various sort of scenarios. And that's why they come to us, that's why they go to the IFS, and then they respect what comes out of that.
Right, there's a couple of themes. One is what's really the value of predictions in a world which is in itself unpredictable, and which most of the speakers have said that political activity changes the future, which is pretty obvious in a way. And the second is the problem too much politics or not enough politics? I think that's a very clear division here.
Vicky Pryce made a plea for more nuance, and she said people go to the IFS because they want a counterweight, if you like, to what the politicians are saying. They want to hear kind of more context about the political claims that are made. But is that what you're going to get by going to the IFS, or are you just going to get another one of these headline figures like £4,300 a year, you know, will be the cost of Brexit? And I know our discussion isn't about Brexit exclusively, but I do think both sides in that debate assumed that people were going to vote depending on the kind of facts that you could just read from a UN yearbook. You know, are we going to save 350 billion on one hand? Is it going to cost £4,300 a year on another hand? And the fact is people don't behave just on those sorts of yearbook figures. All kinds of political and personal and social considerations come into people's behaviour. And I wonder what experts can do if they want to prevent their advice being used in that kind of vulgarised way.
On your second point, Rob, really on too little or too much politics, I mean, I'm not seeking to be a conciliator, but it seems to me that beneath the very sort of strong words flying around on the panel there does seem to be a common element to it, if I'm not being too charitable, which is that in discussing the rise of, or the existence of a technocracy, perhaps it's the failures of the politicians and their relationship to their experts, which is where more of our anger should be. I mean, Vicky says, you know, look at all the procrastination. You know, they got clear advice on things from experts and not just economists, and they fail to do things. I think that's, you know, a valid critique of politicians. They procrastinate and fail to make decisions. On the other hand, Jonathan says, you know, they make some pretty stupid decisions from time to time, and I think that's true as well. I think perhaps they're pretty stupid to have gone along with, you know, 7 years of very easy monetary policies, regardless of the democratic mandate. The point is that has been economic policy across the Western world, and the politicians have gone along with that. In that sense, they've endorsed that decision. So I agree with Jonathan, perhaps different examples, but politicians do make a lot of stupid decisions. And Angus said, you know, the politicians are to blame for buck passing, for passing responsibility to the technocrats. So between you, and perhaps others would, well, perhaps not Iain, because I'll finish on that, would agree that, you know, the politicians and their relationship to technocrats and the way the technocrats have changed in society is what matters. Because there's always been tensions and differences between the politicians and their economists, you know. Think back to Truman and, you know, his desire for the two-handed economist, for his frustration of the economics profession after the Second World War. But what's different, seems to me, is that elevation and that putting on a pedestal by the politicians of the experts, which means that sometimes I think a lot of the criticism is also passing responsibility from themselves. I think when May blames the Bank of England at the moment, I think should be a bit more mea culpa there. Anyway, my point on Iain, which is I think where it comes to, which is I think we do need more politics, and I think your reference to the Thatcher-Reagan years is appropriate, but for a different reason, because I think the rot set in then when we had this emergence of this end of the idea that economic policy could make a difference. So it's a different critique than you're making. You're saying politicians have thought they would be too ambitious or trying to do too much in terms of change things. I think the politics of Thatcher, as we remember, were the politics of Tina. The politics that, there is no alternative, which seemed to be validated by the collapse of the socialists, the left-wingers, the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of that decade. So it seemed to be no alternative to the market. And that got translated into there is no alternative way of doing economic policy either, which has evolved into third-way politics and so on. So economic policy at that stage, from the era of Tina, I think has fallen away from being seen as a legitimate area for politicians to take responsibility for. And in all sorts of intended and unintended ways, the experts have been put on pedestals to take responsibility for that. And I think that's what's created the dilemmas today, and that's what we should be looking at reasserting.
Thanks. First, pro-technocrat point. I don't think there's anything wrong with forecasting as such, even short-term macro forecasting. Indeed, there's hardly an alternative. I'm reminded of the words of the famous Polish economist Michał Kalecki, who was a contemporary of Keynes's, who said, the only worse thing than forecasting is not to calculate or forecast at all. Now, pro-Gove, which is my main point here, and I think there's a bit of passing the buck here, especially by Vicky Pryce, blaming the politicians. And I can think of just two, I think, really big examples. First of all, the spectacular failure to predict the 2008-2009 crisis. I mean, that really is astonishing. And many of these people did, as Gove rightly noted, come back and predict the floor would fall after Brexit. In the short term, not just what Jonathan says, medium, long-term forecasts. And I do remember listening to Vicky Pryce as a pundit saying exactly that, short-term damage. Now she sort of blames or invokes Carney, that he saved the bacon of the doomsters. But I'm afraid that's not all there is to it, and even that should have been quite predictable, that the Bank of England, and he more or less foreshadowed before it that he would do that. And in fact, some of the trends so far, in terms of manufacturing, consumer confidence, it's almost comical how contrary they have been to the predictions of Vicky Pryce and others. Thank you.
I actually agree that we do need a correction back towards politicians making the decisions. And that is really, for me, down to the politicians in the first place. The concern that I have is the way that we're framing it. It's almost attack on experts. And what are the implications for that? What's the implications for things like science? What's the implications for those that buy into their own ideologies, like the Scottish nationalists in Scotland? What are we doing to tackle those sorts of things down the line, the unintended consequences?
I'm actually from the Netherlands, and we have, I don't know if we're doing things better there than we are here in the UK in a sense. I think that it also has to do with one point I haven't really heard much about yet. It kind of ties in what the gentleman over there says. So we've talked a lot about uncertainty of predictions, but not that much, I feel, about what we're actually predicting and what kind of, not only the domain of our predictions or like the range of their validity, but also what are we taking into account when making policy. I think they're actually, from the Netherlands, I look to Britain as a kind of an example with all your discussion about well-being and the like. And I feel that's often missing when experts are consulted. So I feel that there, actually, experts could be a bit more humble and really make clear in their predictions, what are we actually predicting here? What is the economy actually? Because many people in the public don't know what the economy means. So this is one domain I think that should be, and I wonder how the panel thinks about this. Is this a major problem here that should be addressed? So next to uncertainty, which I definitely agree should be addressed, this is also where politics might maybe come in more, whereas politicians could be less concerned with how things are achieved and a bit more humble on their knowledge of predictive power and their knowledge about what experts know or not. They could be more poignant on what do we want to achieve, and then consult experts on seeing how did we get there. So that might be, in my idea, in the ideal world, that would be the distinction between politicians and experts. Politicians saying, what are our goals, what do we want to go, and then honestly consulting a range of experts, of course should be the diversity there as well, and then trying to communicate this as best as possible to the public.
I see problems on both sides. I think there's a tendency for politicians and policymakers to want certainty from the experts. And clearly, as pointed out, there's always uncertainty in almost everything, even many of the scientific area. And on the other side, there are experts who, on the basis of what they want to say, well, therefore, you must do this. When they should be making very clear, this is not an analysis of the situation, this is their views on what should be done. And so I think we have experts wanting to push policy when really they should be laying out the options for politicians and policy makers to decide. And on the other side, politicians and policymakers are wanting certainty from the experts so they can worry about other things. They expect, if you're an expert, well, you can give them the answer, can't you? But you can't.
I wonder if any of the panel have sympathy with an entirely different view of running the economy, the Cowperthwaitian one of not compiling statistics at all because it just means people try and chase them and try and affect them, just moving to a more allowing the economy to move on in its own time.
Yeah, I do have some sympathy with the comments made earlier about the way in which experts have been put up front as kind of... So technocrats are the creation of politicians. So, and then A, they're put on a pedestal, and then B, when things go wrong, they can be kicked and blamed for the situation. Obviously, technocrats then run with these things and start to assert themselves as political power holders in their own right, and that's problematic as well. But it's something that's happened right across government. So we have this idea that's of the last 10 or 15 years of evidence-based policy. We've got rid of political principle or a vision of how we want to see society in the future. What we're going to do is go with the best evidence. And obviously the tendency then is for that to flip around, because you then you look for the evidence that suits you. You end up with policy-based evidence, where people produce evidence to try and influence policy. So that's and that just disguises the political and moral choices that we actually have to make, which I think is very problematic. In terms of what Jonathan was talking about with scenarios, the 4,300 figure, which I think is just as disingenuous in many ways as the £350 million figure from the referendum debate, is one particular scenario. Who chooses the scenarios? Because obviously the Treasury only picked 3 or 4 scenarios to look at, and lots of other people said, well, a lot of this is based on something that would be really stupid to do, even if we had a hard Brexit. There would be a hard Brexit plus real stupidity. So maybe Vicky's got some insight on this, having worked in government. Who picks the scenarios?
Vicky, do you want to come?
Well, in fact, Jonathan and I both worked in government. We were both there at the time of the financial crisis, and indeed, you're absolutely right. Whoever made the point, though we did get it wrong. Although there's all sorts of funny things going on in the States, and of course the regulators were not there. So to ensure that whatever happened, they were there, but they weren't actually looking. So there was this belief that everything was going absolutely fine, and of course we were wrong in that, and things were not going fine. But in terms of how politicians actually behave and the stupid things they do, I mean, the interesting thing is the policy-based evidence bit that was just mentioned. What economists, Jonathan and I, when we were both there, were trying to do all the time is avoid policy-based evidence. And you have no idea about the pressures that technocrats are under to produce policy-based evidence. And our job had been to stop that from happening, making us incredibly unpopular. So this idea that we economists are put on a pedestal, you must be joking. We were constantly attacked and attacked and attacked because nobody wanted to listen to us. So even though there are loads of us, it seemed that the reason for having them is just to make sure they justify that type of policy, because they just weren't strong enough perhaps to argue. And we reorganized things to improve them. Now, some of you people may not like that because it gave economists more of a voice by making sure they were senior enough to sit on boards and so on. But it was a very, very hard struggle. And this scenario thing, we always have in the cost-benefit analysis for anything that we're looking to do, have a negative, and we have a range. Sometimes it can be negative. And the decision of the politicians has to be, are they prepared to take the risk? So it's not that they're not presented with it, they are presented with it, they just then ignore it. And like Osborne did, he just decided to present this one figure when the Treasury was so careful to actually explain the assumptions under which each of those scenarios was there. So it's not true that it's unconditional. Somebody asked that question. We actually do tons and tons of assumptions which are very, very clear. If the politicians then decide to just completely ignore it, then I think that's a point that we need to always sort of watch.
Can you leave it there? Come back to Iain?
Yeah, just a brief word in defence of politicians. Something has changed in our politics to do with the experience that politicians have when they become Prime Minister, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary. And I don't mean the usual sort of public question time cry that they should all have been off and run a business first and then come into politics later, because that never works. We've always run a system where people go into politics relatively young, but the difference is that we started making them Prime Minister and Chancellor actually much younger. If you look at Macmillan was in the House for 30 years, lost his seat once, had to change seat, saw his career rise and fall twice, and only at the culmination of that process does he then become Prime Minister. I mean, I always regard what happened with Blair as the most expensive work experience programme in the world. By the end of it, by year 10, you thought he probably understands government and institutions now quite well. He'd make quite a good Prime Minister, but by which point we'd had the Iraq War and various other disasters. I did just want to make one point, if possible, about the 350 million. It's incredibly interesting to watch how the Leave campaign used this figure to bait the Remainers, because in a sense, I mean, the 4,300 figure is ridiculous. The £350 million figure is ridiculous, but they knew it was ridiculous. I mean, the Leave campaign did it deliberately, and it's incredible that the economists and the campaigners on the Remain side couldn't see what was happening. They were opening bottles of champagne every time Cameron mocked the 350 figure. Why? Because the focus group tested it. The public, the punter, hears it as follows. David Cameron has denounced the lies and said it's not £350 million, it's only £150 million. So the punter thinks, well, they're probably both lying. Somewhere in the middle, it's 250 million. That's still a lot of money. So Cameron and the disastrously run Remain campaign were essentially doing exactly what the Leave campaign had scripted, to which you can say, well, that's cynical and dreadful of them, but they saw themselves as insurgents. They were running against the establishment, and they manipulated it rather brilliantly. I just think it's extraordinary that people are still arguing about whether the figure was true or not. Of course it's not true. It was a piece of pure ruthless power politics, and it worked.
Angus.
And a good thing too. So two quick points on this. I mean, in terms of the predictions and Brexit, bad or not, the British economy, as we've been hearing from Vicky, has been in a terrible state long before Brexit. Right? It has not been an export-driven powerhouse crippled by Europe. It's been in a really bad state before 2008, and it's barely recovered from 2008. That's fine. Good. I'm just reminding you that the British economy has been in a bad situation before, and to the extent that there will be economic problems post-Brexit, you can't blame everything on Brexit, as has been the fashion. Anything bad that happens post-Brexit, oh, it was Brexit. You know, the European economy is not in a good situation either, and that's not because of Brexit, it's because of inherent problems and weaknesses in both economies. Second point is around experts. I mean, I think there's been, it's not against experts. The Ming Dynasty vases, if people are interested in that, consult the expert by all means. It would be mad not to. The technocratic control over democratic politics has been a long time coming. This is not just something that's happened in the last 5 years. The left and right have evacuated the commanding heights of political economy for a long time in different ways, and left it vacant ground to be taken over by technocratic experts. Now, I thought Gove was being maybe a bit over the top in attacking the puffed-up vanity of technocratic experts who, can't even work out whether they're on a pedestal or not. But in the last 30, 40 years, it's gone way beyond just straight economics. But the field of economics has moved into purely subjective factors. They've not been interested in GDP for a very long time. They've been interested in happiness indexes, well-being, behavioral economics, crowd psychology, nudge theory, reaching into people's brains and telling them how to behave. That's the puffed up pedestal of technocratic control, and it's something that we need to kick out of democracy.
According to the World Values Survey, the most recent vintage of that, which is between 2010 and 2014, of people born in Europe in the 1980s, less than 40% believe that it's essential to live in a democracy. Compare that with people born in the 1930s, more than, I think it was 75, 76% thought it was essential to live in a democracy. This is a pretty worrying trend, and it coincides with growing support for non-democratic alternatives of various types, including support for strongmen, authoritarians, military, but also growing support for experts. And it's also been paralleled with the growing accretion of power by non-democratic, unaccountable bodies of various kinds, judges, legal bodies, and so on. So I think those who've emphasized the primacy of politics, are really going in the right direction. I also, and the importance of the Brexit vote really was what people were saying, that we want to improve our ability to hold politicians to account. Politicians have been seen to have failed, or the political parties that have been governing Europe in the post-war period are seen to have failed, including in Greece, New Democracy, PASOK, here. And people want to have more control over their politicians. The answer is more contestation, more politics. And I also think the idea that technocrats are above the fray or insulated from politics is wrong. The reason there's been a consensus behind just about every wrong forecast over the past few decades is that the technocrats, the experts, are really invested in a particular worldview. I come from a forecasting organisation where everybody was so committed to the Remain side that they couldn't actually face up to the possibility, despite the evidence and analysis, that there was a strong possibility that the vote would be for Brexit. So the idea that somehow technocrats are insulated from politics, I think, is just a false one.
As experts in your respective professions or indeed trades, can I call on the panel to avoid any implication of blame passing and to tell the room what they think their profession should do better?
I'll risk making a forecast, and that is that the consequence of the Brexit vote will probably, the opposite to the way it appears, will empower the experts, because I think that the lesson that the political class has drawn from it is that you can't trust the people. And the tendency now, and I speak as someone who lives in Switzerland, where we have rule by referenda, the lesson there that the political class has learned is that you have to keep everything in-house and protect yourself and insulate yourself from the people because you can't trust them. So I think that experts are about to have their day in quite an unexpected way, and it's the opposite of the headlines. I don't think that's a good thing, by the way. I just think it's the trend.
As Vicky said, I mean, the idea that technocrats are on a pedestal, I think, is completely absurd. Those of us outside government do our best to influence policy in the areas where we have some expertise. We're certainly not on a pedestal. Those of ourselves, when we're inside government, have to fight our corner along with all the various other competing interests. Sometimes we make our voice heard at the political level, sometimes we don't. I mean, in practice, I think most of the time, politicians rely on expertise. And there's a famous saying about, relying on so-and-so relies on statistics the way a drunk relies on a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And that often applies to politicians' attitude towards expertise inside or outside government. A couple of brief points. The fiscal and monetary policy point, the point that we've let the central bankers run everything for the last 7 years and that's why it's such a mess. Partly agree, but it's a bit more subtle than that. I would say that what has happened was that politicians essentially ignored the advice, again, not of all economists, but of a consensus of reasonably sensible mainstream economists, that doing much more through fiscal policy was required, and that austerity as it was implemented was a mistake. Instead, like George Osborne, they said, well, we should just, we don't want to do the hard work of using fiscal policy. We'll let monetary policy take the strain. We'll hand it all over to the central bankers, and that way we can blame it on them if anything goes wrong as well. So that was a deliberate, and in Osborne's case, for a long time, quite a successful political strategy. Briefly on the Brexit forecast, just to repeat again the difference between short and long-term forecasts, I said very clearly, I'm on the record as saying that the short-term forecast that Osborne's talk of an emergency budget was scaremongering. I said that at the time. I still think that the long-term forecasts from the Treasury and other similar bodies are probably represent a reasonable consensus forecast of the profession, which I endorse. They're not certain, but and certainly nothing that's happened since the referendum invalidates them in any way. We know that.
What is the value of any of these scenarios outside of whatever political decisions might be taken?
That's the point. The scenarios were intended to present a fairly range-wide of possibilities. Of course, none of the precise scenarios will materialize, nor, even if they did, would the numbers that came out be the precise ones that were predicted. But do the scenarios represent the spectrum of possibilities that will likely end up somewhere in there, and hence the results will end up somewhere in the neighbourhood of what was predicted? I think that's a reasonable...
That's clear then.
Yeah, well, so the scenarios that were presented were hard Brexit, WT only, European Economic Area, Norway model, one or two other variants. Will we end up somewhere in between that? Very probably yes. That's not hard to understand. It shouldn't have been hard to explain, but George Osborne, of course, wanted to talk about it's going to cost you $4,000 a family, which, as Iain said, was just as bad, only far less successful than the 350 million figure, on which I agree entirely with what Iain said about that. I did want, finally, just to pick up the one, what could we do better? Which is a very good question indeed. I think we have to get away, actually, from this idea that we're just neutral technocrats presenting our advice, and it's then up to the politicians to decide what to do with it, and it's their fault if it goes wrong. We do actually, and I disagree with some of the people who said, well, technocrats shouldn't presume to intervene in the political process. I think we do actually have to get our hands dirty. So when during the referendum campaign, I did some very technical stuff about immigration statistics, which, because of its political significance, made it into front page stories in the Sun, the Mail, and the Telegraph. And I could have just sat back and said, well, I just do the numbers. It's up to the politicians and the media what they want to do with them. I regarded it as my duty, even though it did mean getting my hands dirty and going a bit further than I would have liked, to talk to journalists from The Sun and so on and say, look, you're going to present this the way you want to, but this is how you should understand these figures, this is how you should understand what I'm saying. And to try, therefore, to the best I could, in a very limited way, slightly improve the quality of the public debate. So that, I think, is our job.
Any final points or questions?
I don't know exactly how the pay scheme works amongst experts, but amongst the commercial world, you have bonuses, and if you're in a hedge fund or something, you place a bet and you get some reward from it. Could that possibly, having something like that, improve the quality of the or the sophistication of the mathematics and thus increase the certainty? Some people actually are quite certain about certain results and they put a lot of money on it and they get quite rich as a result.
Thank you. I think experts should be careful about saying when they're being an expert and when they're being a politician. So the last point made by Jonathan, that he ought to get his hands dirty from time to time, well, fair enough, but then you're not really an expert, you're arguing a point of view. I mean, economics is difficult, and economists have a very difficult job, but the prediction of economists affects confidence, and there would seem to be quite an aggressive anti-Brexit view from across the board amongst the, using the same old phrases, the self-appointed elite. And I think that the problem is that economists actually could affect the confidence that they're saying is now lacking in the economy. So I think experts should stand apart from the argument in the same way that an expert does in a court of law. They're not there to push one side or another.
Right. 1 minute each, starting with Iain, and then we'll go along.
First point, isn't it? I actually think it's really rather refreshing that people made the judgment in June based on more than narrow economic forecasts related to their own self-interest, that they considered concepts like democracy, culture, all of that. I think it's actually rather cheering. What should our profession do better as a journalist? My God, I'll need more than a minute on that. I mean, I think the only answer really is get a time machine, go back to the creation of the internet, and don't from the start give away all of our content for free. Enforce copyright against Google, and journalism would now be much better off.
We're getting paid more as well.
Exactly. That's the point.
Yeah, if Ian's not going to make the hardcore ideological free market case, then I will. So one of the things that really astounded me with Michael Gove's piece was when he cited Greece, the Eurozone crisis, the financial crisis, and lashed out at technocrats and said, you got this wrong, you caused this, where do you stand? All of these things, in my view, are a direct consequence of political failure, never mind market failure. I mean, the Eurozone is the biggest example of political failure that you could possibly find. And it's a whole other tangent, but the financial crisis, in my view, is exactly the same. And you don't fix, and this has been, as someone said, kind of the core of our argument here is how much politics do you have, how much political interference do you have? And you don't fix political failure by rubbishing science, rubbishing the IFS, wherever it comes from, and putting more blind faith in what we have as well at the moment is increasingly fringe politicians in all parts of the world, politicians who are not in the centre and who are pushing often ideas which are completely at odds with a lot of evidence. In terms of the question, should we have bonuses, should we do this? I think when government tries to mimic the private sector, it often gets it completely wrong. So I'd answer that by saying no, but in conclusion is on this question, politicians, technocrats, in my view, we should have less of both, and we should certainly have fewer politicians with less power making fewer decisions.
1 minute.
Okay, I agree with a lot of what Julian just said about political failure in the Eurozone, for example. I think that's absolutely right. Just on the betting point, well, I do think actually occasionally we should put up or shut up. I famously bet £1,000 with Andrew Lillico, a city or a private sector economist, about the future path of inflation. About 5 years ago, and I'm prepared to take similar bets again. You know where to find me on Twitter.
Thanks, Vicky.
Yes, I would reiterate the point that the euro was basically a political construction rather than an economic one, when in fact it made absolutely no sense. So we can't blame the economists or the technocrats for that, I'm afraid. But your point about democracy is a really, really worrying one, that people don't quite see that there is huge value in that. And yet, I think the one thing that is good about the EU is that you can only be a member if you're a democracy. And that's something that we need to bear in mind, when we look at what we do with them in the future. But I think there was a point about, do we get it all wrong? I mean, of course, economists get sacked if they get things wrong. Like, for example, interest rate forecasts. I mean, it is pretty brutal in the private sector. We're not quite asked to do that type of stuff and forecast in the public sector, thank God. But you can certainly go out of favour very, very quickly if you're telling them things they don't want to hear. So there are, you basically more or less get treatment according to what it is that you say and how wrong you can be, or if they don't like what you're saying. There was a question earlier that nobody answered, which is about statistics. Can we really do without statistics? And up to a point, of course, it links with the question of is it us economists who are bringing the economy down by increasing uncertainty that way? Well, actually, I don't think we are heard that much. The outlets that are being attacked for upsetting, perhaps possibly affecting perceptions negatively, have been constantly two, which is the FT and The Economist, mentioned by all the politicians as being the two that actually influence it, which is really quite interesting. Rather than individual people, I mean, it's interesting being name-checked today and being told what I said before, but it's rather than individuals and what the impact of that has been. But I think there's one point to go back to in terms of how we make assumptions. The interesting thing about what Carney did, and it must not be forgotten, and what all of us economists did before, was say that if nothing is done, and we just leave, of course we haven't left yet, then on unchanged policies as they were until then, because nobody had quite worked out what the implications would be of leaving yet, no plan B, confidence would be affected. It would be affected rather negatively. And that is what the decline would be in terms of investment, because people would just not invest. But what we did in terms of warning that there would be perhaps consequences was actually encourage the institutions of this country, including the Bank of England and now hopefully also the Treasury, to do something to deal with it. Because the last thing we all want for our children or for ourselves is a serious financial meltdown. And I think what the Bank of England did was prevent this from happening. And I think that is absolutely important. They knew that this would be the result. Share prices collapsed straight after the vote. The pound, of course, fell very significantly. Everyone panicked. Everything stopped. What did they do? They went in and calmed the markets. And I think that is very significant.
Thank you. Angus?
I think Julian, Jonathan and Vicky are reliably and predictably completely wrong on the European Union, which is a failure precisely because it's an economic union and not a political union. It's an economic union forced over the national self-interest and local politics of the countries that make it up, the member states, who've lost their national sovereignty, which is one of the reasons it was a good thing to reject that failed economic technocratic union. That's the problem writ large of technocracy, is the European Union. Just to finish, paraphrasing Ronald Reagan, you're in trouble when the man from the government comes and says, I'm here to help. Politicians can be a problem, right? But I think it's even worse when we hear from Vicky saying, hi, I'm Mark Carney. I'm from the bank. I'm here to help.
Can I have a big hand for all the speakers?